The asteroid field had no name. It was not worth naming. It sat at the far edge of map space, past the shipping lanes, past the patrol routes, past anywhere that mattered. The Galactic Council had marked it as dead space on their charts 3,000 years ago and never looked at it again. Drell did not care about council charts. He was a salvager. He cared about what was worth money and what was not. The asteroid field was full of old metal, broken chunks of something that had once been large, something that had come apart a very long time ago. His ship, a small and ugly vessel with a cracked heat shield and engines that made a sound like a dying animal, drifted slowly between the rocks while his scanner swept the field. His crew was four. Himself, two brothers named Pav and Breck who handled the cutting tools, and an old female engineer called Was who kept the ship from falling to pieces through a combination of skill and fury. None of them had any education worth mentioning. None of them had connections to anyone important. They were exactly the kind of people who ended up in places like this. The scanner hit something strange on the third sweep. Drell almost missed it. The reading was buried so deep inside a large drifting rock that his equipment barely picked it up. But it was there, a steady, rhythmic pulse coming from inside the asteroid. Not natural, not random. Something made it. Something built it and set it running, and it had been running ever since. Pav and Breck cut it out. It took 4 hours. What they found was a small metal object, roughly the size of a storage container, completely sealed, covered in material they had never seen before, dark, dull, almost soft-looking but impossible to scratch. On its surface, in raised lettering that had survived whatever had happened to this place, were symbols none of them could read. Was held it for a long time without speaking. She said it was not transmitting into space. It was transmitting inward, like a record keeping itself alive. Like something that did not want to be heard but wanted to remember that it existed. They took it to the nearest council archive station because they had no idea what else to do with it, and because council archives paid reasonable finder fees for old relics. The archivist who received it was a young clerk who almost filed it under general debris. But the material of the casing triggered an automatic flag in the system, a very old flag, set so long ago that most of the clerks on duty did not even know flags like that existed. The flag called for a senior historian. His name was Davin. He was old, even by the long-lived standards of his species. His skin was the pale blue of deep water, and it had grown thin with age. His eyes were very large and very dark, and they missed very little. He had spent 80 years in the archives studying dead civilizations, species that had burned out, collapsed, been absorbed, been forgotten. He found them interesting in the way that a person finds a dried flower interesting. Beautiful once, gone now. He looked at the casing for 2 full days before he opened it. What was inside was a data core. The format was completely unknown to current council systems. It took him 11 days to build a reader that could access it at all. When he finally did, the first thing that came up was a date, not a council date, not any calendar in current use. A human calendar date. He had to look it up in deep archive records to translate it. When he did, he sat very still for a long time. The date was from 3,000 years ago. A few weeks before the event recorded in Council classified files under the title, Terminus Action, Solar Region 7, which was the Council's name for the destruction of a small star and its planets in a remote system that had shown what the Council called unacceptable development patterns. The species living there had been called humans. Davin read everything in the data core across the following 3 days. He did not sleep much. He ate at his desk. His assistants left him alone because he had a look on his face that his assistants had learned meant he should be left alone. The data core was a record of everything. The human civilization, their history, their science, their culture, their music, their arguments, their jokes, their fears. Everything packed into this small object and buried inside a rock in dead space, time to wake up and start signaling if certain conditions were met. Conditions like sufficient time passing and the signal being received. It was also a message. Not a plea, not a warning, a statement. At the very end of the data, after all the records of what humans had been, there was one final file. It was a short recording. A human voice, recorded 3,000 years ago, speaking in a language Davin had to translate word by word. The voice was calm. It did not sound frightened. It sounded like someone finishing a task before leaving for a long journey. The recording said, "We are not all gone. Some of us were away when you did what you did. We know who you are. We know what you decided. We have written it all down. We are going to be away for a while, but we are coming back." Then the countdown that had been running in the background of the file for 3,000 years reached zero. Davin stared at it. Then every long-range scanner on the station screamed at once. There is a thing that happens to people who survive something that should have killed them. They change. Not always in ways that are visible, not always in ways that are loud, but something inside them shifts, permanently, the way a bone that breaks and heals does not come back exactly the same shape as before. Now imagine that happening to an entire species, across 3,000 years. The ship called Long Memory was the oldest vessel in the human fleet. It had been rebuilt so many times over the centuries that almost none of the original material remained. But the name had never changed, and neither had the record kept in its central log. A record that had been copied from ship to ship, generation to generation, without a single line removed. Every name of every human lost on the day the council burned their star. Every name of every child born in the dark years after, in cold ships running with their signals off, hiding in places no one mapped. Every name of everyone who came after that, right up to the present day. The log was 412 volumes long. Admiral Rhea Strand had read all of it, not because it was required, because she had wanted to know exactly what she was carrying. She stood now at the forward viewport of the Long Memory and watched the stars. They were different stars than the ones her ancestors had known. Her people had moved far, over 3,000 years. They had gone deep into regions the Council had never charted, had never cared to chart, because there was nothing there worth controlling. And there, in the cold and the quiet, humans had done what humans apparently could not stop doing. They had built things. Not just ships, not just weapons. They had built schools and hospitals and farms on hollowed-out rocks. They had built music halls inside converted cargo bays where children who had never seen a real sky grew up performing concerts. They had built systems of law and ways of settling arguments and methods of growing food in places where food had no business growing. They had built a civilization that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed, because the rest of the galaxy had assumed they were all dead. That assumption had been a very expensive mistake. The fleet that now moved through the outer dark was not the desperate collection of survivors that had fled 3,000 years ago. Those people had had 3 ships. What moved now was 11,000 vessels, ranging from small fast scouts to ships so large they generated their own gravity and housed permanent populations. The technology aboard them represented 3,000 years of human development with no outside interference, no council permission, no restrictions on what was acceptable to research. Humans had spent a long time studying one specific problem: how do you destroy a star? Because they wanted to know how it had been done to theirs. And once you understood how something was destroyed, you understood how to protect against it. And once you understood that, you understood a great many other things besides. Rhea was 57 years old. She had been chosen as admiral not because she was the most aggressive or the most brilliant tactician, though she was both of those things, but because she was the most patient person the selection council had been able to find who also understood how to fight a war. Patience was considered the most important qualification. This mission required someone who could hold back when holding back was the right choice, who would not mistake the arrival for the victory. The arrival was not the victory. The arrival was just the beginning of a very careful process. She turned from the viewport and walked to the center of the bridge. Around her, crew members worked quietly. The bridge of the long memory was not a grand place. It was functional and slightly worn, the way a tool used correctly for a long time becomes worn smooth in the right places, marked by work. There was no ceremony here. Everyone knew what was happening. No one needed a speech. A young officer named Tal looked up from his station. He was 24 and had grown up on one of the generation ships, the kind of person who had never seen a planet and was about to see many of them. His eyes were careful. He said, "The archive station has gone to emergency broadcast. The council knows we are here." Rhea nodded. She had expected this. The countdown in the data core had been a deliberate signal, not a mistake. They had wanted the council to have a little warning, not enough to prepare, just enough to understand for a few moments before things began that this was not an accident. She said, "Begin the broadcast." The message went out on every frequency simultaneously, in every council language, translated perfectly from records that humans had spent centuries studying. It was not a long message. Rhea had written it herself and had cut it down many times until only what needed to be said remained. It said, "We are the descendants of the people you decided to erase. We have been gone a long time. We are back now. We are not interested in destroying the galaxy. We are interested in one specific thing. What was done to our home has to be answered for, and the systems built to erase people who do not comply have to end. Every species living under the Council's rules has a choice to make. We suggest you think carefully before you make it." Then it said, "We are willing to talk first." Rhea stood at the center of her bridge and waited. Across the fleet, 11,000 ships held their positions and waited with her. No weapons charged, no aggressive movement, just presence, vast, patient, undeniable presence. Somewhere far away, in a grand circular chamber built to make smaller beings feel small, 7 very old beings who had held power for centuries looked at their scanners, and for the first time in a very long time, felt something they had made sure no one else was allowed to feel. They felt afraid. Arrow had been a diplomat for 6 years. He was considered very good at his job. He was calm under pressure, quick with language, and had a rare ability to make the other side of a negotiation feel heard even when he was not planning to give them anything. The council trusted him with difficult situations. That was why, when the emergency session ended and the 7 elders needed someone to make first contact with the returned humans, they chose him. He was given a single small ship. No weapons, no escort. Those were the humans' terms, transmitted back within an hour of the human fleet's broadcast. 1 diplomat, 1 ship, coordinates to a meeting point at the edge of the fleet. He was not given a choice about going. He spent the journey, 14 hours, reading everything the council archives had on humans. It was not much. The public records were almost nothing, just a vague note about a resolved territorial issue in a remote region. The classified files were more detailed. He had high enough clearance to access them. He read them twice and then sat in his seat and looked at the wall for a long time. The classified files explained very clearly what had been done and why. The why was the part that sat badly with him. Not a war, not a conflict, not even a series of escalating incidents. Humans had simply been growing faster than the Council was comfortable with, developing technology without Council guidance, making contact with other species without Council permission, showing a pattern of independence that the Council's internal models predicted would eventually result in a challenge to their authority. So the Council had removed them, quietly, cleanly, and then buried the records. Arrow was 31 years old. He had not been alive when this happened. Neither had his parents. Neither had anyone alive today. But he felt something sitting in his chest that he did not have a clean word for as he read those files. Something heavy and complicated. The human ship that met him was small, deliberately so, he understood. They were making it easy for him. The docking was smooth. When the airlock opened, Two human crew members were waiting, both calm, both in plain dark uniforms, neither of them carrying anything that looked like a weapon. They nodded at him and led him through a short corridor into a small room. The room had a table, two chairs, a viewport showing open space, and on the table a ceramic cup of something hot set on his side of the table. Admiral Rhea Strand was already sitting in the other chair. She did not stand when he entered. She simply looked at him. She was older than he had expected, silver hair, a face that had been still for a long time, the kind of face that had made a decision so far in the past that the decision had become simply who she was. She gestured at the chair across from her. He sat, he looked at the cup. She said, "It is a drink made from dried leaves. We have been growing them for about 2,000 years. You do not have to drink it. It is just something humans do when they want a conversation to go well." He wrapped his hands around the cup because the room was cool and it was warm. She asked him, "Did you read the files before you came?" He said yes. She said, "Good. Then we do not need to spend time on what happened. We both know what happened. What I want to know is whether the council sent you here to negotiate or to delay." He had been prepared for many opening statements. Not that one. He said, "Honestly, I was told to negotiate. I do not know if the council means it." She nodded as if that was the answer she had expected. Then she did something he had not anticipated. She pushed a small data chip across the table to him. She said, "This contains records your council does not know we have. Communications between the 7 elders from 3,000 years ago. The internal debate before Terminus action. Their exact words. You will find that the argument for destroying our system was not security. It was convenience." He picked up the chip. His hand was steady. He was good at keeping his hands steady. She said, "I'm going to tell you something true because I think you are someone who can hear it. We did not come back to burn the council's worlds. We came back because what was done to us is being done to others right now, more quietly, and it has to stop. There are 14 species currently under council economic restrictions that amount to controlled starvation. There are 6 species whose development programs have been quietly sabotaged because their growth rate concerned the models. We have been watching for 200 years before we came. We know what is happening." He said, "How did you watch without being detected?" She almost smiled. She said, "We had 3,000 years to learn patience." He looked at the data chip in his hand. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. He said, "If I take this back and show them what is on this chip, the hardline faction on the council will call it fabricated." She said, "Yes, but the moderate faction will not, and the member worlds watching this conversation broadcast in real time will form their own opinion." He looked up sharply. She said, "Did I mention this room is being broadcast to every species in council space? Not through council channels, through ours, every word since you walked in." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "That is either the most dangerous thing you could have done or the most effective." She said, "We spent 3,000 years making sure it would be the second one." He drank the tea. It was bitter and warm and strange, and he did not dislike it. He sent one word back to the council before the next stage of talks began. The word was legitimate. The council chamber erupted. The member worlds watched, and across the fleet of 11,000 ships, a quiet signal passed from ship to ship, not a command, not an order, just a single piece of information passed between people who had waited a very long time. It said, "It has started." Elder Marin had been on the council for 51 years. She had outlasted 4 complete rotations of the other seats. She had built relationships, managed crises, absorbed scandals, and survived things that had ended the careers of beings considerably more talented than herself. She had not done this by being soft. When the broadcast from the human ship hit every screen in council space simultaneously, when billions of beings across dozens of worlds watched an alien diplomat sit across from a human woman, and call what was on that data chip legitimate. Marin made a decision. She did not consult the other 6 elders. She did not wait for the moderate faction to respond to the broadcast. She walked to the secured communications terminal in her private office, and she contacted Fleet Commander Druss, who commanded the Council's first response force, and she gave him a single order. Remove the flagship. Druss was a precise person who followed orders precisely. He moved the first response force into firing range within 3 hours. 11 warships, the best the Council had, each one carrying a stellar compression cannon, the same class of weapon, upgraded and modernized, that had been used on Earth's sun 3,000 years ago. He targeted the long memory and fired all 11 simultaneously. He was not a man who left things to chance. From a distance, the strike looked impressive. 11 beams of compressed stellar energy crossing space in parallel, converging on a single point. The kind of firepower that had ended civilizations before. The long memory did not move. Druss watched his screens and waited for the ship to come apart. It did not come apart. What happened instead was that the energy hit the hull and spread across it in a flat wave, like water hitting a wide stone, and dissipated. Not absorbed by shields, there was no shield signature. The hull itself had done something with the energy, distributed it, conducted it away. He had never seen material do that before. He had 4 seconds to be confused about this before the human fleet responded. They did not respond with weapons immediately. The first thing that happened was that 200 small human ships moved with very high speed into precise positions around his 11 vessels. Not attacking, surrounding. In the time it had taken his weapons to charge and fire, the humans had placed themselves in a geometry that made his fleet's next shot impossible without hitting each other. Then the long memory's weapons came online. What they fired did not look like any weapon in the Council's recognition database. It was not a beam. It was not a projectile. It was a pulse, low and wide, that hit each of the 11 Council ships at a specific point on their hulls, the same point on each ship precisely identified. The drives on all 11 vessels shut down simultaneously, not destroyed, shut down, like someone had found the off switch for each one and pressed it at the same time. The ships drifted, powered down but intact, life support still running. No crew killed, no hull breaches, just stopped. Druss sat in his command chair and stared at his dead console. His escape pod launched automatically when the secondary systems failed. He did not choose to launch it. The ship decided for him. The pod was collected by a human vessel 20 minutes later. The humans who came aboard the pod were 2 crew members with a medical scanner and a sealed food container. They checked him for injuries, found none, and one of them said, "We are going to take you to a holding area that is comfortable. You will not be harmed. You will be returned to Council space when this is over." He said, "What did you do to my ships?" The human, a young man with dark eyes and an expression that was not unkind, said, "We built a way to stop that weapon specifically. We have been studying what it did to our sun for 3,000 years. We know everything about how it works. If your people had used anything else, we would have had a harder time of it. As it is, your fleet used the one weapon we prepared for most." Druss had no answer for that. Elsewhere in the pod bay, another escape pod was being collected. This one belonged to a young Council fighter pilot named Sess. He had been part of the escort formation for the first response force, a young man on his second assignment, flying a fast interceptor that had been knocked offline by the same pulse that had stopped everything else. He came out of his pod ready to fight and found that there was nothing to fight. The human crew member who met him was a woman about his own age. She handed him a blanket because the pod had lost heat. He took it, not because he wanted to, but because he was cold. She did not say anything threatening. She did not say much at all. She just led him to a seat in the bay and made sure he was stable and left him with a container of water. He watched through the bay's small viewport as the 11 disabled Council ships drifted in formation, completely intact, nobody dead, just stopped. He had trained his whole career on stories about how dangerous the human threat was, about the Class Omega designation, about why they had been dealt with before he was born. He looked at the water container in his hands. He looked at the woman who had given him the blanket, who was now checking on someone else with the same calm efficiency. He thought about the broadcast he had seen before the attack, the one where the human admiral had spoken about 14 species under controlled starvation and 6 development programs quietly sabotaged. And he thought about the fact that his own homeworld had been under council economic restrictions for 30 years, restrictions his government called reasonable and his people called slow suffocation. He drank the water. Back on the long memory, Rhea stood at her console and read the damage report. Hull readings, normal, crew casualties, 0. She had known the weapon would come. She had built the ship to take it. She sent a new broadcast, not to the council this time. To the people. She said, "Your leaders just tried to use the same weapon that killed our world. It did not work. We have not harmed your soldiers. They are safe. But I want you to see what your council chose to do when offered a conversation. Decide what that tells you about who is making your decisions." 3 member species of the council sent withdrawal notices within the hour. The council chamber had no word for what was happening. They had built their whole world on the idea that some problems could simply be removed. They were learning, very slowly, that this one had removed itself and then come back with receipts. The Accord seat was the most defended structure in the galaxy. It had been built 4,000 years ago in deep space, away from any planet, away from any system that could be used as leverage. Its location was not secret exactly, but reaching it required passing through 8 layers of defensive perimeters, each one capable of stopping any fleet in known space. The Council had designed it, assuming their enemies would come with a fleet. Rhea did not come with a fleet. She came with 4 ships, small ones, the kind of ships that read as civilian on most scanners because the hull composition was designed to look unremarkable. She had spent 6 months identifying the maintenance traffic patterns for the Accord seat, the supply runs, the worker rotations, the systems that had to come in from outside because nothing in deep space grew on its own. She had learned which corridors went quiet at which hours. She had learned where the life support controls were, and the power distribution nodes, and the places where the defensive systems had blind spots, because they had been built by beings who assumed their enemies would come from outside rather than arrive quietly and wait. She brought with her 40 people, not soldiers exactly, humans who had spent their careers learning how to move through built environments without being the thing that triggered the alarm. Humans who understood architecture and systems and the way power flowed through a large structure. Humans who had studied every available schematic of the Accord seat for years before this moment. And one alien. Cess had asked to come. He had been aboard the long memory for 2 months by that point, long past the point where he could have been returned to Council space if he had wanted. He had not wanted. He had watched the broadcasts. He had read the data on the chip. He had had long conversations with Rhea's staff about the economic restrictions on his homeworld, and had received, for the first time in his life, actual numbers rather than council talking points. He had walked into Rhea's office and said, "I know the Accord seat's internal layout. I did a training rotation there 4 years ago. If you are going inside, I want to help." She had looked at him for a long time. She had said, "Why?" He had said, "Because my homeworld has been slowly starving for 30 years, and the people responsible for that are sitting in that building making it policy." She had nodded and given him a plain dark jacket to wear that would not stand out. The insertion took 11 hours. The 4 ships came in with the regular supply rotation, matching the transponder signatures of vessels that had been quietly intercepted and held at a safe distance. Inside the Accord seat, the normal rhythms of a large bureaucratic facility continued without interruption. Thousands of workers and administrators and their families lived and worked there. Rhea's instructions to her 40 people had been simple and absolute. Nobody gets hurt who is not actively trying to hurt you. Life support and civilian systems stay running at all times. If you have to choose between the mission and an innocent person's safety, you choose the person. They moved through the station like water through cracks. Sess led them through service corridors he remembered from 4 years ago. The layout had not changed significantly. Bureaucracies rarely changed their layouts. He moved with a steadiness that surprised him, because he had expected to be afraid and he was, but the fear was sitting somewhere underneath a much larger feeling that he did not have a precise name for yet. Purpose, maybe. The Council's security was substantial, but it was designed for an attack, not for a presence that was already inside. By the time the internal alarms registered anomalies in the power flow, Rhea's team had already secured the main control hub, the communications array, and the 6 corridors that led to the council chamber. The security personnel who arrived found humans standing in their way who were not threatening anyone, just standing there, calm and immovable. Every confrontation that could have turned violent did not turn violent because the humans simply did not escalate. They held. They waited. They spoke when they spoke, in reasonable voices. Several of the station's civilian population actually opened doors for them, not because they had been asked to, but because they had seen the broadcasts. Because when someone unlocks a door for the people who are not shooting and keeps it locked for the administration that just tried to use a Starkiller weapon, they have already decided where they stand. The 7 elders were found in the council chamber in full session. They had known something was happening for about 20 minutes and had spent that time in heated argument about who to blame. They were still arguing when the chamber doors opened. Rhea walked in alone. Her 40 people stayed outside. Sess stayed outside. She walked across the wide floor of the chamber, a human woman in a plain dark jacket in a room built to make anyone inside it feel insignificant. She did not look insignificant. She did not look triumphant either. She looked like someone completing a task. She sat in the central speaker's chair, the chair built for whoever held authority in this chamber, and she looked at the 7 elders. She said, "I would like each of you to explain on the record why you approve the destruction of the human home system. Your exact reasoning, your exact words. We are broadcasting this." The eldest of them, a being who had held his seat for longer than anyone alive could remember, said, "You have no authority here." She said, "You had no authority to do what you did either, but you did it, so let us talk about authority." The chamber was silent. Outside, on 100 worlds, on ships, in homes, in the corridors of stations that had been slowly strangled by council policy for generations, people watched the broadcast. Some of them had never heard of humans before this week. Some of them had never been told that a species had been quietly erased for being inconvenient. All of them were watching now. Seth stood outside the chamber doors and thought about his homeworld's fields that no longer grew enough to feed everyone, and about the council policy document he had read 2 months ago that explained, in very clean language, exactly why that was considered an acceptable outcome. He thought that acceptable was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Inside the chamber, the questioning had begun. 2 years after the fleet arrived, the galaxy was messy. This was expected. Rhea had told people it would be messy. She had said it in every briefing, every broadcast, every conversation with the Transitional Council that was now attempting to do in 2 years what the old council had spent 4,000 years making impossible. Build something that did not depend on one group deciding who else was allowed to grow. She had been right about the mess. Old resentments that the council had kept sealed under pressure were now open. Species that had been kept apart by policy were now dealing with each other directly for the first time, and finding out that direct contact without a mediator who controlled the terms was complicated. Borders were disputed. Resources that had been allocated by council decree were suddenly up for renegotiation. 3 separate small conflicts had broken out in regions where council suppression had kept a lid on things for so long that nobody had learned any other way to resolve disputes. Humans were everywhere, not as rulers. Rhea had been very clear about that from the beginning, and the human Senate that governed the remnant had agreed. No permanent seat on the transitional council, no territorial claims, no special authority. They were there as engineers who knew how to build things in hostile conditions, as doctors who had spent centuries developing medicine for environments the council had ignored, as teachers in regions where the council had kept education deliberately limited, as soldiers when asked, keeping peace in the 3 conflict zones while the transitional council worked on longer solutions. It was not a clean story. Clean stories were for people who had not lived in the actual world. But things were different, that was real, concretely, measurably different. Sess went home. His homeworld's economic restrictions had been formally lifted within 3 months of the council's dissolution. The supply routes that had been quietly made expensive enough to be inaccessible were open now. He had gone back to see it for himself, expecting. He was not sure what he had expected. He had been away for 2.5 years by then. He had left as a council fighter pilot and come back as something he did not have a good word for yet. The fields were being replanted. That was the first thing he noticed coming in on approach. Vast stretches of his world that had been left fallow because farming them had become unprofitable under council pricing were being turned over and seeded. It would take years before the yields were what they should be, but people were planting things. That meant they believed there would be a harvest worth waiting for. His mother did not recognize him at first. Then she did, and she held on to him for a long time without speaking, and he let her. He had a long conversation with his father that night about what he had seen and done. His father listened without interrupting. At the end, his father asked him one question. Do you think they are good people, the humans? Sess thought about it honestly. He thought about the woman who had handed him a blanket in the pod bay when he was cold and had not asked anything in return. He thought about the human engineer who had worked 16-hour days for 2 months fixing the water reclamation system in the station's residential sectors, while the political situation around them was still completely unresolved, simply because the system needed fixing and people needed clean water. He thought about Rhea, who had walked into the most powerful room in the galaxy with 40 people and no weapons, and had sat down and asked questions. He said, I think they are people, the same way anyone is people, but they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and they put it down carefully instead of throwing it. His father nodded slowly. The tribunal for the 7 council elders was held on neutral ground, run by the Transitional Council, with representation from 43 species. Human lawyers testified. Human archivists provided the evidence. But humans did not control the proceedings and did not determine the outcome. Rhea had been firm about that. The justice for what was done to humans could not belong only to humans. It had to belong to everyone who had been touched by the system that made it possible. The eldest elder, the one who had been in his seat the longest, who had been in his seat when the original decision was made 3,000 years ago, he died before the tribunal concluded. Natural causes. He was very old. He had never shown anything that looked like remorse in any of the recorded sessions. One of the others wept during testimony, not in a way that seemed performed. She said she had been young when she voted for terminus action and had believed the reasoning at the time and had spent 50 years since then not thinking about it because the alternative was thinking about it. She said, I don't know if that is an excuse. I know it is the truth. The tribunal considered it. They decided it was not an excuse. It was context. Context for understanding how these things happen, not a reason to undo what had happened to the survivors. The sentences were of the restorative kind. Forced testimony, public record, the complete declassification of everything the council had kept sealed, and a legally binding requirement to cooperate with the documentation project that was compiling a full history of council actions over 4,000 years so that no one in the future could claim not to know. The Memorial World was Rhea's last project before she stepped down. It was built in the region where Earth's star had burned. Not a reconstruction, no one could rebuild a star, but a habitat large enough to walk in, with an artificial sun calibrated from old records to match the light of a world that no longer existed. Inside it, humans had planted everything they could recover or reconstruct from 3,000 years of preserved genetic material and archived descriptions. Grasses, trees, a kind of flower that had been extinct for 3 millennia, rebuilt from fragments of information that nobody living had ever seen. Alien visitors were welcome. Many came. The habitat became a quiet place, not a monument to victory, a monument to the fact that something had existed and mattered and been taken away and was being remembered. Rhea walked there on the day she stepped down as admiral. She was 60 years old. She wore civilian clothes for the first time in a decade. She walked through a field of reconstructed grass under an artificial light that was almost the right color, and she found a small green leaf on a plant that should not have survived 3,000 years of extinction, and had survived anyway because someone had cared enough to write down its genetic structure before everything was lost. She held it in her palm. It was very small. It was the right shade of green. She stood there for a while, not thinking about victory, not thinking about the tribunal or the transitional council, or the 11,000 ships still holding position, or the 43 species still arguing their way toward something better. Just holding a small leaf that should not exist, in a place that should not have been built, under a light that was almost but not quite the same as a sun that was gone. Just standing there breathing. That was enough.